Okay, good afternoon. On behalf of Washington Association of Wheat Growers Animal Program, I'd like to welcome you today. We are excited to continue with our 2021 Educational Outreach Program, and thank you for joining us for this timely and important discussion. For today's webinar, please keep your line muted, and we will have time at the end for questions and discussion with the speaker. Following the presentation, Randy Cease will act as moderator to bring the discussion to Pacific Northwest concerns before opening up to audience questions. Randy is the president of the Whitman County Wheat Growers, board representative to WAG, and was recently appointed to the Federal Ag Policy Advisory Committee for Trade in grains, feed, oilseeds, and planting seeds. We congratulate him on that appointment and thank him for assisting with today's event. We are excited to welcome Peter Zeihan. You may have seen him at past Tri-State Grain Growers conventions. Peter combines a deep understanding of geography, demography, energy, and trade to help his clients make sense of a complicated world. Fortune 500 companies, trade associations, policymakers, and government agencies at all levels regularly rely on his expertise. Please welcome Peter Zeihan.
Hey everybody, it's good to see you again. Last time it was November 2019, saw you in person up in Spokane. I'm looking forward to being able to travel and see you guys again. I'm happy to report that we'll have a little bit of information in this presentation on that. We are almost through coronavirus. But I'm still going to be saying a lot of things that are likely to make a lot of you really uncomfortable. And to that end, I'd like to start with something that we all agree on, something that's not controversial. So let's start with politics. The American political system is not like most other democracies. You don't, the way we do it is you vote for somebody who's running for a very specific district, voting for somebody who wants to represent a very specific geography and population. And they don't need to get a majority of the votes. They just need to get one more vote than the next guy. That encourages our parties to be relatively big tent parties, to throw wide nets in order to get that marginal extra single vote. To that end, our parties are made out of groups of factions, with these being the ones we recognize, and then some swing voters in the middle. But for those of you who have been awake and alive for the last 5 years, you may recall that the relationships are breaking down. We've had the Sanders revolution, we've had digital media and social media, we've had the evangelicals rise as a political force, the unions have turned sharply anti-trade, everything's in motion. And as of the 2016 general election, this is how things actually shook out by the numbers. Things are changing. So instead of thinking of the traditional Republican and Democratic alliances, I find it easier to look at American politics on a matrix like this. The closer you are to the top, the more you want the government out of your personal life. The closer you are to the right, the more you want the government out of your wallet. If you're on the left, you think that the government should play a larger role in the economy. And if you're down near the bottom, you think the government should maintain a role in regulating social morality. And of course, you can combine these categories. So if you're at the bottom right, both an economic and a social conservative, you probably oppose the food bank program on principle. And in fact, you think that starvation builds character. And if you're at the top right, a social liberal and an economic conservative, you think that the sole purpose for government should be to gather all of the bureaucrats in the world together in Washington, D.C. and build one gigantic nuclear bomb and set it off. And then the rest of us can just get on with our lives. Here are the traditional swing voters in American politics. Here is the Democratic Alliance that we understand. Here are the Republicans. And here is everyone together. Now, what has happened in the last 5 years, first and foremost, is that Donald Trump has successfully galvanized the populist conservatives and brought them in from the cold. Based on whose numbers you're using, somewhere between 10 and 20 million voters who hadn't voted in the last 4 or 5 elections showed up that hadn't showed up before. This makes the populist conservatives not simply the largest voting bloc within the Republican coalition, but the largest voting bloc in the country. And they now dominate the Republican Party's institutions. But as Trump has drawn people in, he's of course also driven people away. Fiscal conservatives butted heads with Donald Trump in his first year when he put through a series of spending increases not matched by tax increases. And when they had the nerve to say something about it politically, Trump then started to campaign against them and push them out of Congress. He also expunged them not just from his administration, but from the Republican Party itself. They functionally are no longer Republicans. Something similar happened with military voters. Trump brought in a lot of generals to fill out his cabinet when he had a hard time finding expertise. And when they started to make conscientious objections to some of his policies, he ran them out of the administration. And so by the time we got to 2019, they were all gone. And relations between the Pentagon and the White House were the worst that they have been in living memory. They are gone. The business community started out on a better footing. We had a number of advisory councils that were set up to bring in CEOs to advise the president. We had a big deregulation push. We had changes in the corporate tax policy. Everything started off great. But less than 6 months in, Donald Trump had broken with and dissolved every single one of those advisory boards because he wasn't really interested in hearing their advice. And he sent them all home. Relations cooled considerably from there, but it wasn't until we had the mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic that the relationship really turned cold. And now, a year on, the business community is no longer welcome in the Republican Party at all. Unions, however, switched sides. They liked the anti-free trade rhetoric. They signed up in droves to join the Trump version of the Republican Party, and they voted en masse for their guy. There was a split within the Catholic community, with some going in a more doctrinal or a more secular direction, and the rest, the majority probably, turning almost into evangelicals and equating social morality and social policy with political power. They turned out to be one of the strongest voting blocs for Trump. And the one that most people miss is the Hispanic vote. Yes, undocumented Hispanics tend to be liberal. Yes, young Hispanics tend to be liberal. Yes, first-generation Hispanics tend to be liberal. But of those three categories, 2 of them can't vote. And so the Democrats that have gone out to try to attract these groups have mobilized people who can't support them. But second, third, fourth generation legacy Hispanic voters, they're social conservatives to the core. And the issue they are most conservative on is immigration. They like the idea of the wall. They want to give more power to ICE, and they loved Donald Trump. And with very few exceptions, Trump carried almost every single border county in the United States. This is today's Republican Party right now. Now, things are in flux on the left as well. They've obviously screwed up with the Hispanics, and they've obviously lost the unions. But Team Biden has also forcibly ejected the socialists from their coalition. Now, there's a lot of pieces to this. In part, it's that Biden realized that what the socialists were standing for and supporting was something that wasn't popular with most Democrats, much less most Americans. And so he publicly repudiated a lot of their big ideas like packing the Supreme Court or college debt forgiveness or the Green New Deal directly and publicly in the debates. But he also brought Barack Obama in from retirement to campaign against woke leftness. But I think the big issue, the one that turned most socialists against Biden and vice versa, was the decision to go with Kamala Harris as his running mate. She was a district attorney, pretty good one, put a lot of people in jail. And that was something that the socialist left simply could not abide by. And so they functionally are no longer Democrats. Now, I'm sure some of you are like, wait a minute. We're in the Pacific Northwest here. You know, what about Black Lives Matter? What about those protests last year? What about Portland? Well, let's talk about Portland. This is exactly what it looks like. This is Darth Vader in a dress, riding a unicycle while playing a flame-throwing bagpipe. Portland is not representative of what the United States was, is, or ever will be. Portland is no more the United States than Disney World is. And when it comes to the protests themselves, if you factor out the first week when they started in Minneapolis, and of course Portland, we never had more than 100,000 people protesting at the same time. wasn't, strategically speaking, politically speaking, all that big of a deal. Now, it's just that because of COVID, we'd all been starved for human contact, and whatever came across our screens got a lot more eyeballs than normal. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't an issue here that that would behoove us to deal with. Racial inequality, economic inequality, police brutality, the Proud Boys, Antifa, all of this is worthy of discussion and being addressed. But perspective and context are important. Anywho, that's where we are roughly. The Democratic Alliance is kind of floundering and it's really stretched. The Republican Alliance has consolidated around a social conservative core that is very powerful, both politically and in numbers. Or at least that's where we were until January 6. Now, everybody seems to have their own interpretation of what went down. And honestly, you keep your politics to whatever you think it is. From my point of view, from the point of view of political change in the United States, the critical fact, whether you believe that this was all Antifa or all Trump, doesn't matter. The critical fact is when the Capitol complex was being stormed, the president refused to deploy the National Guard or even regional police to protect his own law enforcement personnel. The fact is, in the aftermath of the attack, the Republican Party simply hasn't been able to get their minds around what they need in order to purge this faction from their alliance. And if the Republican Party is no longer the party of law and order, that has consequences. Because the faction that cares about law and order the most is this one. The business community has staff and assets and supply chains and reputations, and they cannot function in a country where a political party simply doesn't support law and order issues. Now, environmental and social governance has been rising up. It's a regular topic in boardrooms. Inequality issues are a regular topic. Racism is a regular topic. The idea that the business of business is fading pretty aggressively. And one of the things that we have seen is that it is shifting in the general direction of the Democratic Alliance. Team Biden, I think, has noticed this because of the over 2,000 people that Biden has appointed to positions as president, as is his prerogative. Only one of them is from the socialist camp, something that the socialists are furious about. In addition, if you look at the top people in the administration, particularly in places like commerce or the FDA, they are all very pro-business. This is not an Obama 2.0. This is something different. Biden seems to be making a play for the business community. And if he's successful, this would be what that alliance would look like. Now, whether you love this or hate this, I don't want anyone to get overly excited or overly dejected. This is still shaking out. We are 5 years into what is normally a 8 to 12 year process. It makes sense that we're seeing some of the edges of what this could be, but we're not done. Politics evolves. It follows changes in culture and social norms and technology and geopolitics. And if you look back over the last 30 years, we've been kind of busy. We've had the end of the Cold War, the globalization wave. We're now in a deglobalization wave, and the baby boomers are nearing mass retirement. Of course, we are going to manage our political system. It'll be loud, it'll be uncomfortable, but we'll get through it. And it's not just us. Every democracy is wrestling with some version of this. 3 years ago, the French equivalent of both the Democrat and the Republican Party both dissolved into chaos. They're still sifting through that wreckage. Now, whether you love this or hate this, now's the time to act because it's gelling. This is the time that you can find a lever and make it move. And especially if you consider yourselves part of the national security, fiscal, or business communities, and you want to be a Republican again, now is the time to move. Because not everybody in that circle wants to grab a Confederate flag and a bear mace and march on the Capitol. They realize that things went wrong. There's a lot of churn. But if you wait 2 years, it might be too late. So this is where we are right now as a country. Let's talk about where we've been and what that means. At the end of the Cold War, the Americans changed the way the world worked. We deployed our Navy to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could trade with anyone at any time for whatever reason they wanted. They didn't have to go out militarily and secure anything first. We did it for them. In exchange, they had to be on our side versus the Soviets. And that created the bilateral system of the Cold War of the Soviets versus pretty much everybody else. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And Americans have been edging away from that with ever greater speed. And I'd argue that we have reached a break point. Because if you want to maintain this system, there's three things you have to have. First, you have to have a political culture that is committed to globalization. I'd argue that that was gone long before January 6th, but in the aftermath of January 6th, forget it. We can't have a conversation about anything right now. And even if you assume that Joe Biden is the guy who can fix this, who can get us all back on the same page, come up with a plan to go back out into the world, even if you believe that, how long do you think it's going to take him? A month? His whole term? More time than he has? Until we get there, we're only going to have a foreign policy that's perfunctory at most. I mean, this is a decade-long transition. Second, you have to have global interests. I would argue we've really never had that. As a percent of GDP, the United States is the least involved economy in the world, always has been. And that's by design, because if we had made ourselves the dominant economic force in the world, we couldn't have fought the Cold War, because the whole world would have been our colony. So that's not there. Third, you need boots on the ground. You need a global position that allows you to micromanage the entire planet to keep everybody on the same side and the bad guys down. That requires troops everywhere. This is the total number of troops that we have had abroad since the beginning of the Cold War. You can see it's been trending down for quite some time. We now have less than 10,000 troops in the entirety of the Middle East. It's not that we have decided as a country to leave. It's that we have already left. Globalization is already over. And what's left is simply running on inertia. That's the strategic side of the picture. Let's talk about the economic. Now, this is a standard demographic profile: children, young adults, mature adults, retirees, men on one side, women on the other. This is Mexico, a consumption-driven system, because they've got a lot of people aged 40 and under who are raising kids and going to college and buying cars and homes. That's what drives a modern system. We like this. This is what we like to see in our trading partners, because young Mexicans are relatively new at their jobs. They're relatively low value add. We're high value add. We do design. And so the integration of those two systems is very complementary. In addition, all those young Mexicans purchase a lot of product from us. Mexico became our largest trading partner in calendar year 2019. It is a position they will not give up in our lives. This is a partner, and this is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 50 years ago. They have yet to recover, and honestly, it's now so degraded they never will, which means they have a lot of people in their 50s and early 60s with literally decades of experience going head to head with the American workforce in terms of product. But there aren't any young Koreans, so they have to export what they make. We will never have a trade surplus with South Korea. From roughly 1980 to 2015, the world was in a perfect demographic moment. Here we got a bunch of major economies back in the year 2000. We had a general balance between young demographies like Mexico's today and older demographies like Korea's today. And with the Americans holding up the ceiling, we had explosive trade, particularly when the Cold War ended. It was the greatest period of economic growth in human history in terms of personal incomes, in terms of national GDP, and in terms of the volume and value of trade. Everyone did better. But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older. The consumption-led systems are turning into export-led systems. The export-led systems are aging out into something I call post-growth. And the global demographic of both high consumption and high production was coming to an end anyway. Now, in the United States, we are a partial exemption to this, and it's largely because of what went down with our baby boomers. Now, our baby boomers are not unique. There is a baby boomer cadre globally in almost every country for all the same reasons. After World War II, there was a big urbanization push. There was a big economic boom. People had a lot of kids. But our baby boomers did something that really none of the others did. They had a lot of kids. And so you say what you will about our millennial generation, and there's so many things we can say about the millennial generation. They've got something going for them that their equivalents around the world lack. They exist. And that means that where the rest of the world is aging into obsolescence, the United States has bare minimum at least another 30 years. Let me give you an idea of the scale of what that means. This is the world's 50 largest consumption-led systems stacked up by size. Here's where they are in 2020, and here's where they'll be 10 years from now. There's the export-led systems. As a class, they're vanishing very, very quickly. Right now, we only have one country that's aged into mass obsolescence, that's Japan. But very soon, folks, this is it. Global consumption, global production, they're peaking right now, and they will never recover in our lifetimes. And the really scary thing, this was all before coronavirus sucker punched everybody. This is new coronavirus positive tests per capita on a 7-day moving average. So it's broadly comparable country to country. Anything that's under that anything that's over that double red line of which is about 5 per 100,000 per week is considered the endemic level. Anything over that means that you really can't root out the virus without a mass vaccination program. Now, what I'm seeing here is that we've got the 3 largest consumption-led developed countries, France, Britain, and the United States, and the 3 largest consumption-led developing countries, Mexico, India, and Brazil, that are all in some degree of coronavirus crisis. You'll notice that India is pretty low, but honestly, that's because they don't test anymore. I just put that in there for fun. And with them not recovered and really impossible for them to recover until mass vaccination, that tells me that the consumption-led part of this planet is just offline right now. So it doesn't really matter if you're an export-led economy, if you can get coronavirus under control, because there's no one to sell to. Now, here in the United States, I broadly expect us to complete our vaccination program in the first half of the year, maybe even in May. But that's just not soon enough, because for the rest of the advanced world, they're looking at the last quarter of this year, probably at the best case scenario, which means we can't even begin the developing world until next year. That's not enough time. We knew that in the first half of this decade, that capital supplies, production, and consumption were all going to peak. And we have lost all of calendar year 2020 and almost all of calendar year 2021. And for most of the world's population, all of calendar year 2022. It's already over. The peak of globalization was in January of last year. And most countries will never recover to that point. Now, amidst all this depressing talk, there's some good news out there. I'd like you to meet William Shakespeare. That's literally his name. He is the 2nd person in the UK to get the vaccine. So let's talk about the vaccines. These 3, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, or the Oxford formula. These are the mRNA formulas, and these are the ones that are currently in distribution. The first 2 in the United States, AstraZeneca is the British one, and it's starting to be distributed in parts of Europe. What they have in common is they're this new method, mRNA, but it's not that new, really. It's based on gene therapy, which is now 30 years old. When people are concerned about it being developed so quickly, you got to keep in mind the process for doing vaccines. They normally take 10 years. But remember, 85% of vaccine formulas ultimately don't work out. It's a big financial risk. So the first 7 of that 10 years is simply raising the money. Say what you will about Donald Trump. Operation Operation Warp Speed was a wild success because it compressed 7 years of fundraising into a single phone call. And so that was taken care of right off. The next 2 years of the process are usually spent decoding the genome. Well, we finished the Human Genome Project 15 years ago. That's now pretty basic technology when it comes to medical developments. So we were able to decode the entire genome in about 3 weeks. Okay, so that 8 years got compressed into 3 weeks. That's pretty good. What about the last bit, the testing? Normally it takes a year to do the testing projects, but by combining a couple of stages, we instead did it in 10 months. So the only part of this that was really sped up was from 12 months to 10 months. It's not a big deal. The problem with these three vaccines ultimately is you need 2 shots. And with the Pfizer one, it has to be stored in dry ice. So it's not that we can't apply this across the United States and maybe even across the developed world, but this isn't going to solve the global problem. For that, we need these 2. Now, Novavax and the J&J formulas, they're a little different. They do not require the advanced manufacturing of the first 3. Both of them are refrigerator capable, and the J&J one, which I'm really looking forward to, is a single shot formula. So it can slot into any mass vaccination program anywhere in the world, and that ultimately is the shot that most people are going to end up getting. So where does this mean for us? We are likely in the United States, in the worst case scenario, to be swimming in extra vaccine by July. We're going to have enough for well over 450 million people in July, and there's only 330 million Americans. More likely, with some of the advanced purchases and the advances in manufacturing, that will happen in April. But regardless, we are looking at having the coronavirus crisis behind us in the United States in June. We're almost there. Okay, we're a little past halfway here. Just a reminder that if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A bar. We're just gonna keep on going. Let's talk about some of the new arrangements that are coming in. Trump administration's trade policies broadly were a success. Now, we've got 5 deals that Trump went after: Korea, Japan, Canada, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. Of those, everything but the United Kingdom deal is done. And of them, only the Mexicans really had any leverage in trade talks. The Koreans, their country doesn't exist without American security overwatch. Canada does not even have the option of pivoting. The UK destroyed its links to the EU, so it's either a deal on Washington's terms or a depression. And it's seared into the collective Japanese memory what happens when you cross the Americans. Only Mexico has something that we wanted: a growing market, a young demographic, a complementary economic system. And so we'll probably get a deal with the UK later this year, and that'll be it. These are the only ones we're going to see. Now, I know a lot of you do business with Japan. I see that as stable. I'm not going to try to talk you out of that. But longer term and bigger picture, the 2 neat deals that are ultimately going to matter to you more are Mexico and the UK. Mexico, because it's a young, growing, up-and-coming demographic that is eating more and better food as they age and as they develop. And then the United Kingdom, first world economy, 65 million people. 1/3 of their food comes from the European Union. That's now in doubt. 1/3 of their food is only being able to be produced economically viably because of European Union subsidies, which are now gone. So you're talking at potentially 2/3 of the food that 65 million first world customers consume needs to be replaced. I can't think of the last time American agriculture got that kind of gift, and it's probably going to happen this year. Now, the last time I showed you, or saw you guys, I showed you this graphic. It's price versus volume for crude oil production. The broader the bar, the greater the volume of the crude production. OPEC's there in black on the right. The taller the bar, the greater the cost of producing it. And US shale is there on the left. Now, this data is now almost a decade old. Back then, we kicked out about 4 million barrels a day. That's more than Iran at its peak, but for a country the size of the United States, it wasn't really a game changer. It was a nice to have, but it didn't really change the math. But since then, we've had all kinds of breakthroughs. And here's where we were at the dawn of the coronavirus crisis. The break even was compatible with everyone in the world with the exception of Saudi Arabia. And the volume had reached the point that we were net energy independent. Now, because of coronavirus, because of the price crash, because of the global recession, the US shale sector has taken a few hits. But honestly, production's only down by a little less than 10%, which considering the scale of the challenges is pretty impressive. We also have something that's called a frac log that probably has 500,000 to 1 million of barrels of pent up production where the wells have already been completed. They've already been hooked up to the pipe collecting infrastructure. They just haven't been turned on because the price isn't right. As smaller companies get shoved out of the system because of financial problems and cash flow problems, bigger companies take over. And they have a little bit more budget discipline when it comes to when they throw the stuff onto the market. So if we got prices in the vicinity of $60, $65 for like a month, I have no doubt that we'd be back to technical energy independence. But if you've been watching the news, you know that there's a few complications going on right now. We've had an Arctic air burst that has gone all the way down into northern Mexico, and at present, fully 25% of the electricity generation in Mexico is offline. Now, some of that is because wind turbines have gotten too icy and they've had to shut down. But that's only about a third of the story. 1 million barrels a day of oil production is offline with a commensurate equivalent of natural gas. A lot of refineries shut down just because of the cold. So we're talking about a huge disruption across the entire industry. The place in the country that is, the place in the state of Texas that is facing the greatest disruption is Austin, the capital, where I used to live, where the people who make decisions on regulations live. What does that mean going forward? Well, we know that de-icing a turbine costs a few $1,000s a turbine. It's expensive, but it's quick, and you only have to do it once and you move on to the next one. So either they're going to wait for everything to thaw or they're going to de-ice them. That stuff will come back on. But that's only about 1/3 of the power distribution problem. Excuse me, that's only about 1/3 of what's offline. The other 2/3 is primarily coal and natural gas, because the coal plants, they've discovered that the coal is fused to itself in the pile. And then, of course, you've got the problems that are going on with production and gathering in the Permian Basin, where the crude oil has partially gelled up within the pipelines. Normally, this isn't something you have to worry about in Texas. But now we know that the entire Permian Basin has to get weatherized for weather that they normally only have to deal with once every decade or so. That is going to hurt the shale rebound, because this is something they've never had to worry about. Now, if you're in the back end, or even if you're just in Oklahoma, you do this as a matter of course. Texas has never had this kind of weather during the shale sector, the shale revolution of the last 10 years. They just have never done it before. It can be done. It's not technically challenging, but it is an added cost. And that would suggest that the smaller companies that were already under a degree of financial stress because of coronavirus simply aren't going to make it through. So forget Biden. Forget funding from Wall Street. Weatherizing the Permian is the single biggest challenge facing the shale sector, both in terms of technical work and maintaining output, for at least the next year. That means we should expect a stall in US energy output for at least the next 12 months. Does that mean that if there's a crisis, the United States can't get back to functional energy independence very quickly? No, it does not. But it does mean you're going to see a lot of weird pricing stuff and a lot of panicky news articles about how the United States has failed and that the shale revolution is failed and we don't know what to do. Take that all with a grain of salt. Like everything else, we will get through this, but it does mean that the structure of the industry is going to evolve somewhat. Speaking of evolving sectors, there are 6 manufacturing sectors that have been forced to come back to the United States faster than the others because of coronavirus. The first 2 are ones that you probably wouldn't think of: wiring and textiles. They don't require a lot of people. It's not very technically advanced work, but what it does need is cheap electricity. And courtesy of the shale revolution, the United States has the cheapest electricity in the world without needing subsidies. And so it's been coming back in a big way. The next, electronics and semiconductors. This is kind of the best and worst of all worlds. Electronics, there's nothing particularly technically challenging. You just need different price points for your labor. And so the Mexican-American border region is fantastic. So whether it's Texas or California or Nuevo León or Monterrey, all of it works pretty well. And we're seeing this stuff coming back. And this is probably the biggest employment boost from the relocations that we've seen so far. Semiconductors is a little different. That's a lot more specialized work with a lot more specialized infrastructure required because everything's done at the same place. From melting the silicon powder into liquid, drawing it into a crystal, slicing it into wafers, then doping and etching and baking the wafers and breaking them apart into chips and turning the chips into semiconductors, all that's done in the same place because it's all clean room work. And you can't relocate stuff from one structure to another without then having a clean transport chain, which is very expensive. So these facilities do not move easily, but when they do move, they all move at once, and they've started to move. We've got 2 in Phoenix now, 1 under construction, already done, and we're probably going to need about a half a dozen more. But for you guys, the ones that matter more are automotive. Automotive is something we're very good at this country, particularly the Texas-Mexico nexus, because a lot of parts going back and forth for various stages of development. But what really matters for you is the connection between that and heavy machinery. Automotive, everybody does a lot of everything. Automotive is kind of the same way, but it's a much more focused and concentrated sector because not everybody needs a backhoe. Now, during the globalization period, especially post-2000, all heavy machinery in the United States, all the manufacturing of all of it relocated to China because of price. But there's a clause in NAFTA 2 that says 80% of the parts that go into the finished product to be sold in North America have to be made in North America. So there's a panic among the industry about how to move this stuff back as quickly as possible. And you can't do this overnight. So across the agricultural sector, you have to be prepared for shortages in equipment until the infrastructure and industrial plant can catch up. And we'll probably start feeling that tightness this year. Fast forward 2-3 years, problem solved, it's all here. But between now and then, you could absolutely face some big price increases that are not expected because of problems where the physical footprint of the industrial plant happens to be. Let's talk about our new Secretary of Agriculture, who is our previous Secretary of Agriculture. This is Tom Vilsack. He's also from Iowa. I had the dubious pleasure of meeting the guy briefly when I was working for the legislature back in the 1990s. I can't say that he was a well-loved person. He honestly has a lot in common with the new president, Joe Biden, in that his political views shift with the winds, so you never know what about him to take seriously. In my opinion, that's problematic in a leader, but it also means in specific environment, it might actually work out because we're in a transition period. So, you know, what happened before anyway is kind of up in the air. Now, there are 4 policies that he kind of wants to spearhead. The first is coronavirus relief for average families. Think of it as a glorified food box program. I don't think there's anybody in the agriculture sector that has any problem with that whatsoever. He did this on a much smaller scale during the Obama administration, did a great job in my opinion. He's just amping up the scale. Second, he really wants to double down on biofuels. Now, as a developmental economist, I have a lot of problems with that, but it's something that is definitely a political vote getter back in Iowa. For you guys, not a huge issue. Third, climate change, something that's kind of the banner for the entire Biden administration. Specifically, he wants to do a lot of pilot projects on carbon capture. Now, a couple things to keep in mind in case you're getting a little squeamish about this. Number one, none of these projects will be unfunded. You can actually volunteer if you want to. Second, the goal is to have the pilot projects completed by 2023, at which point the carbon capture projects can then inform follow-on policy. So at least today, he's not even thinking about something that will impact your operations unless you volunteer to get paid. There might be policy changes after 2023, but considering the general mood of the country when it comes to government funding, you'd probably be paid for that too. So there's nothing here to be too scared of, in my opinion. And then finally, fourth, he says he wants to take big agriculture down a notch in favor of family farms. And to that end, he has announced absolutely zero details. He said this when he was Agriculture Secretary last time around, and nothing came of that either. So I wouldn't take that one too seriously. So overall, there might be a few things of interest on the agenda there, but nothing that really moves the needle for you guys. For things that are going to move the needle, wow, there's a few things going on. First of all, I would like to introduce you to Catherine Tai. She is the incoming trade representative. Now, the USTR is responsible for negotiating and enforcing every trade deal on the books. And Catherine Tai is woefully underqualified for this. She's never led a significant negotiation. That doesn't mean she'll be bad. It just tells us that she's going to be focused on different things, because Tai is a trade lawyer. She sues countries, and the country that she has sued the most in the past is the People's Republic of China. She's likely to be a very busy bee moving forward. Second, we should expect relations with the Europeans to go from bad to worse. Now, we've got the United Kingdom's trade deal that's coming up, and by siding with the UK, by default, we'll be siding against Europe. That's unavoidable. The Europeans have completely botched the vaccine rollout, and so there's already a lot of bad blood from them towards us because ours is actually going pretty well. But perhaps more importantly, trade tensions were already simmering with the Europeans under Obama, much less Trump, much less now. You throw Tai into the mix, and there's probably going to be a lot of lawsuits. Remember that the European demographic is awful. They are now an export-led system to every single country, and they cannot function in a non-globalized world, especially if the United States is no longer holding up the ceiling. The Europeans of late have also decided to sign a series of deals with the Russians and especially the Chinese on investment, while just kind of glossing over various things that are happening in the political sphere with human rights and genocide. And we're probably going to see some repeat. Remember during the Obama administration, the Europeans had all these air pollution laws that they lambasted the United States for not having, but then German car manufacturers were basically injecting smog into the system and the Europeans did nothing. It became up to American states to enforce European pollution laws on Europe. We're going to have some version of that, but with trade all wrapped up in it. And of course, Joe Biden remembers how badly the Europeans treated Obama back when Obama was president. When Obama came in, he asked for two things from Europe: more troops for Afghanistan and some stimulus spending to help the world recover from the financial crisis. He got neither. And so Biden knows not to expect too much. The Russians. Russians are always good for a laugh. We've got lots of cyber going on. We've got lots of election meddling. Right now, they're in the process of working to get Parler back online. They're backing white supremacists, environmentalists, Black Lives Matter, Proud Boys. They're involved in anything that makes Americans dislike other Americans. The big difference between Biden and his predecessors is that this time around, in large part because of the shale revolution, the US doesn't care at all what happens to energy markets. So Team Biden is likely to go after the Russians where it hurts because they're not concerned about the blowback at all. We've got a big fat stimulus package, 1.9 trillion, at least for the first one. We'll probably have a second one before it's all over. And it's all driven by kind of a Buy American provision, which honestly is just America First by a different name. Now, normally when the president says he wants to change supply chains, I'm like, whatever. I hear this every 4 years. But this time around, with coronavirus and with everything in flux already and now backed up by $1.9 trillion in government changes, I'd take it a little bit more seriously. We're going to see significant government-driven, forcible rearrangement of supply chains. For most Americans, that's going to be a broad positive, but it really depends upon what you care about. Fifth, Iran, 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 Iran. We're unlikely to get a new nuclear deal this year. In part, that's because Biden is distracted by other issues. But more importantly, Iran is insisting on going back to the original terms that were set by the 2015 deal with President Obama. Now, the world has changed since then. Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign has crushed the Iranian economy, and Iran's paramilitary position across the entire Middle East is in tatters because they've run out of money. The Europeans also aren't interested because if Iran doesn't have any money, they have no economic reason to sign on to a deal. So to see Biden going in that direction, I think is kind of silly. He's going to wait until the Iranians realize just how much has changed, and then he'll impose a much stricter deal, assuming one happens at all. In the meantime, Iran has no choice but to try to get what leverage it can in other ways, because it can't get them in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq. It doesn't have the money to do that. So it has to interrupt things that other people care about. Around New Year's, the Iranians hijacked a South Korean tanker. The idea was that the South Koreans were abiding by American sanctions, and the Iranians wanted to instill a price on countries that did that. Trump did nothing. And then Biden came in, and Biden has done nothing. We don't care. 10 years ago, we would have sent in the Marines, but we've done nothing. And so the Iranians are forced to do either one of two things: completely capitulate or up the ante in the hopes that someone cares. And since that someone isn't going to be the United States, there is a very real risk of a major global energy disruption that the United States doesn't care about at all. And then finally, there's what's going on with the Chinese-American relationship. The Chinese are getting a little desperate. What growth the Chinese had in 2020 is from inventory build. Their demography is sharply terminal. Their economic model is facing collapse. And so they're closing ranks. They're demonizing outsiders. They're hunkering down for what they fear is going to be an economic collapse. And on our side of the equation, we've had a big change in policy. On his way out the door, Donald Trump threw a couple of grenades into the relationship. He said that any American diplomat or bureaucrat could visit Taiwan without needing to seek approval first, and could go as a representative of the United States, which is about that far from formal recognition, because, Taiwan actually is an independent country. And on Xinjiang, the Trump administration said it's a genocide because, it is a genocide. Biden on his first day put his personal stamp of agreement on both policies. He also continued every single sanction and every single tariff that the Trump administration put in place, including those on Huawei and the Chinese equivalent of Chevron Texaco. We've got new policies coming in on Hong Kong and Tibet any day now. And he sent 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to do drills in the South China Sea. And then there's Catherine Tai, don't forget the US Trade Representative. In addition to her having the most experience with Chinese issues, she's ethnically Taiwanese. The Chinese interpret this as a full court press against their interests, and they're not wrong. Now, none of that means they can't strike back, but it does mean their options are extraordinarily limited. There just aren't very many sectors where they can hurt us more than the other way around. Unfortunately for you, one of those sectors is agriculture. This is the percentage of various products produced in the United States that are ultimately exported. Your guys's are the ones that are in green. Now, there's a few lessons from this. The first is in any trade dispute, in any version of globalization that breaks down, you guys are really the only sector that's going to suffer in the short term. And China in particular has already made the decision that they will never, ever again purchase any American ag product unless there's no other purchase option available. That's why we saw the collapse in Chinese demand for American products going up until September. But by September, they had cleared out the rest of the world, and they really only had a choice of buying American stuff. Southern hemispheric production this year is expected to be below average. That's great for you guys, but you're still going to have to sit back and watch as the Chinese hoover up every last bit of everything before they come back to you. That's going to cause some pain. Second, specialty crops are going to get harder than normal staples, both because they're for specific markets and because they're more sensitive to changes in consumer status. That's just unavoidable. That's broadly positive for you. Third, this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Until globalization breaks down to the point that the supply chains that fuel your competitors abroad weaken, inhibiting their ability to grow crops, this is the world you're in. You're last in line, at least with the Chinese. But you're also going to be facing conflicts with the Europeans. Fourth, there are limits to how bad it can get, because there's only so much agricultural production globally. And as countries that are getting a little persnickety, like China, start to use this club, they can't use it against everybody. So for example, consider barley. The Chinese boycotted Australian exports of barley, which was a godsend for you guys. So whichever country like pisses off the Chinese first, they might lose, but everybody else kind of gains. So you got to take it for what it is. Okay, I am above 50 minutes, so I'm going to cut it off there. Hopefully we've got a bunch of questions that have been loaded in, and I will turn to those now. So Lori, where do you want to start?
We will turn it over to Randy for his
Randy, right.
questions.
I've got a few questions for you, and then we can let everybody else have some. And quite a few of these are on trade. You were showing all those demographics on age. And, you know, Trump kept us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But looking at Southern Asia, is now the time to rejoin that group? Because, you know, we export so much of our wheat and to North Asia, and it makes kind of sense to go to that Southern Asia region.
Your problem moving forward for, like, say, the next 5 years is assuming for the moment the global system really breaks down like I'm anticipating. Long-haul transport is going to get a little dicey, and any place that cannot guarantee its own regional sea lanes is going to be a little questionable as an export destination. So within NAFTA, there's no problem because there's no one that can hold a candle to American naval power. The United Kingdom and Japan are logical destinations because they have the world's second and third most capable navies. Beyond that, though, you got to get a little careful. Now, Southeast Asia specifically, I think, is one of the up-and-coming regions of the world that will do pretty well in the world that is post-globalized. But you do have a couple sharp pieces of competition from the Kiwis and the Aussies. Also, you've got to get the crop there. And it's unclear at present if the United States under Biden or Biden's successor is ultimately going to be interested in running security for that specific route. Your most reliable option is probably to get in very, very, very good with the Japanese, because they will have strategic and economic interests in this region. And if you can kind of piggyback off of their security programs, you should be fine. But it will require just a little bit more upfront diplomacy and math on your end.
The Pacific Northwest, we export almost 90% of the wheat that we grow. Therefore, we're really tied to the value of the dollar. You know, when the dollar gets really high, then we really lose out on our export business. What do you foresee happening on the value of the dollar?
Well, I have some horrible and some wonderful news. First, the horrible. It is difficult to imagine a world where the US dollar is not at a multi-decade low. There's no other hard currencies of size left in the world except for Canada. The Brits and the Europeans, for various reasons, basically aren't swimming in that pond anymore. And as long as that is the situation, I just do not see a world where anything but the dollar is going to be a store of value or a meaningful trade currency. On the positive side, this applies to inputs as well as to sales. And 80% of agricultural production around the world is dependent upon at least one imported input. And if you break that down, and it's still going to be denominated in dollars, you're going to have a catastrophic drop off in the ability of a lot of countries to grow food in mass. In that world, it doesn't really matter what the dollar is, because countries will have a choice between finding the hard currency or not eating. And the last thing that a country does before it turns out the lights is stops food imports. So again, the problems for you guys in this transition are front loaded. But on the backside of this, there just aren't a lot of countries that are major producers and major exporters of foodstuffs who can function in a deglobalized world. You're one of them. You're one of like 6.
We have a lot of issues with WTO since it really doesn't have any teeth to back up a lot of our trade issues that we have. What do you think the future is going to hold for free trade without WTO actually having any teeth?
Well, you're going to find out real quick. WTO definitely has ceased functioning as a trade arbiter. The new Secretary General, a Nigerian lady, is a developmental economist, and she's made it very clear she has no interest in arbitrating trade disputes. She just wants to help the poorer countries of the world use trade to kind of bootstrap them up. Admirable goal, probably not an appropriate goal for the World Trade Organization. So you need to get along very well with people like Catherine Tai. And you need to get as far up on her to-do list as possible to sue the pants off of anyone who's causing you problems. That is how trade will be resolved in a legal context moving forward. But the broader, the wiser, the simpler approach is just to make excellent relations with end consumers in countries that you will be able to get to. You can't beat Mexico. Japan and the United Kingdom are solid choices. But anything further down the line just gets problematic because there isn't going to be a global trading system.
The Biden administration is really moving us away from coal, oil, and natural gas. And so what effect do you think this is going to have? We just can't, everybody thinks we're all going to go to electric cars and everything, but they don't ever stop to realize where the electricity comes from.
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about that. The Biden's green plans are honestly not all that aggressive. The whole idea of suspending new leases on federal lands, for example, doesn't really move the needle. Most of the people who produce on federal lands have permits that allow them to produce for at least another 4 years, in many cases as many as 10. In addition, less than 10% of American petroleum production comes from federal lands anyway. So it doesn't really move the needle. Most of this is state prerogative, and not even Congress can stop that. That's been resolved in the Supreme Court many, many times. And your point about moving everything to electricity is a good one. If we electrify everything, we need 4 times as much electricity. And there's no way that you can build out that kind of power demand and decarbonize at the same time. So I fully believe that we're going to be putting in more wind, we're going to be putting on more solar, and hopefully in a few years, we're going to be putting in a fair amount of battery. But I don't see that actually reducing the demand for oil and natural gas in this country by any appreciable amount this decade.
I've got some other questions, but I'd like to open it up to other people that have them.
All right, we've got quite a wide variety coming in. First one comes from Curtis. A recent poll suggests that a majority of Republicans and independents now favor a third party, citing neither the Democrat or Republican are functional or serving their best interests. Is a third party viable in the U.S. in the immediate future or ever?
In the long term, definitely not. The first past the post system, where you need just one more vote than the other guy, encourages large, broad parties. And third parties, as a rule, tend to be pretty narrow. So the idea of Trump going off and founding a Patriot Party or more old guard business, national security, and fiscal Republicans forming kind of a throwback Republican Party, if it does happen, what will happen is one of the 3 parties will swallow one of the others. And historically in the United States, this has happened 5 times. But the third party has never survived more than a single presidential round. Because what happens is the 2 parties that are ideologically closest fight over a share of the vote, and it's not enough to get them that marginal extra vote. And they both lose badly. And then there's some sort of combination. So if it is going to happen, it's going to happen now, but it will be over by 2025.
Okay, we've got 2 questions relating to China. First from Bob, what effect of the China Silk Road will there be on globalization in USA? And from Ben, how serious is the China-Australian trade dispute, long-term or just a flash?
Let's start with the latter one. The dispute is real because it cuts to the heart of propaganda within the Chinese system. They are not going to back down as long as they feel they have an option. And as long as there's other barley to be had or other coal to be had, they're going to go for it. But every political dispute that the Chinese pick narrow options for the next one. So you just have to keep that in mind. They're going to keep going after Australians until either the Australians back down, which is unlikely, or until they've cornered enough of the rest of the market that they have no other option, or someone pisses them off more. Highly likely. So take that for what it is. In terms of the Silk Road, the Belt and Road program, wow, what a waste of money. The Chinese have built $1 trillion of infrastructure in places that didn't have infrastructure. We've been globalized now for 75 years. Any place that even had a modicum of an economic case to get a road or a rail line or a port or whatever already has one. The Chinese are building things in places where no sane person would ever go. So for example, yes, they ran a rail line around through the Central Asian countries into Afghanistan. What does the winner get? These are the very definition of white elephant projects. In addition, the Chinese aren't paying for this. They've said it's all loans. And when the loans come up, what we've seen under coronavirus is every single person the Chinese lent money to said, you know, dude, there's a global recession on. We're not going to pay that right now. And if the Chinese have tried to seize anything, either it gets nationalized immediately or the people or the countries just repudiate the loan altogether. So from start to finish, this is $1 trillion waste of money. And honestly, for Americans, I think we need to find something a little bit more realistic to worry about because this is not a concern.
Okay, from Larry, Europe is going down the organic path and can't feed themselves. Are we headed that direction also? And then maybe somewhat similar from Peter, what do you forecast the future value of farmland in the US?
The second one's easier, so let me deal with that one first. Farmland is available in limited supply. It's a largely illiquid market. Very little of it's for sale at any particular time. I see no reason to expect farm prices to go down anytime soon, probably not for decades. I mean, we'll still have a lot of this, but it's still going to gradually go up. Because as we move into a system where we have abject shortages in both capital and food supply, American farmland is a logical place for foreign and domestic investors alike to want to put their money. It's kind of the platinum standard for what you're after. So you're just going to have to get used to that or revel in it if you like that. Organic food is kind of a messy topic. Even if Europe were to go nearly 100% organic, they have so much surplus production, they could probably still feed themselves. I've always looked at it as an environmental issue. There are a few industries in the world that are more environmentally damaged, both in terms of runoff and carbon, than green farming. That's one of my personal beefs. I don't see the United States going that way. I see consumer choice driving the conversation, and I see that reducing overall the amount of food that is produced. But that's assuming you look at it in isolation. There are a series of new technologies that are past prototype and are now starting to enter mass usage that are going to remake agriculture, and specifically row crop agriculture. We now have gotten good enough with facial recognition that you can use it for plants, which means that you can have a combined piece of farm equipment that has fertilizer and pesticides and irrigation equipment hooked up to it that can go down the row crops, take a photo of each individual plant and identify if it's a weed, and if so, what kind. Is it a healthy plant? Is it a sick plant? Does it need fertilizer? Is it infested with bugs? And it just squirts each individual plant with whatever is necessary. We're moving from industrial farming to industrial gardening, where each individual plant gets individual care. It's going to have a smaller it'll have a smaller carbon profile. It will require less fuel. And because you're only squirting the plants instead of broadcasting stuff, it'll have significantly less chemical application as well. It's kind of a win-win-win unless you're a fertilizer company. What this will do is push hard the consolidation process that you guys have seen over the last 30 years, because not everybody can afford that equipment. But for the companies and the farms that can, you're talking about a doubling and tripling of agricultural output over the course of the next decade. You can't do that with organic.
Other ones, Lori?
There is nothing in the chat box. So Randy, if you have
Okay.
more, if anybody else.
Sure, I got a couple more.
Go ahead.
One that hits a little closer to home is that a lot of efforts anymore on trying to remove our 4 dams on the Snake River because of salmon. And we've got a representative right now from Idaho who's really pushing a plan to do just that, and in exchange for big payments to us. And I just wondered whether you thought of eliminating electricity is a good idea, especially in the form of clean energy, in the form of hydroelectric, and getting rid of those dams, which we move our wheat on barges, which is very green.
Sure. When it comes to the environmental case, I'm totally on your side there. When it comes to the economic case, I'm totally on your side. But what you're describing is a local political issue and that you guys are going to resolve yourselves. If it were entirely up to me, if I were king for a day, I would prevent things like that happening. But ultimately, that is your call. That is not a federal call for the most part. So you guys are going to have to figure that yourselves. Well, I realize that there's a federal component there. But ultimately, if the state of Idaho and the legislator of Idaho and the governor of Idaho don't want it to happen, it's not going to happen. Something to keep in mind when it comes to power. Right now, the American electricity grid is not set up for the green transmission. We do not have lots of high voltage transmission lines. And until we do, electricity is going to remain a local prerogative. And I don't think we're going to get there in the next 5 years. So if you want to make the environmental case when it comes to carbon in favor of keeping things the way they are, I think that is something that would resonate with this administration.
Look, you mentioned the wall. So, Biden wants to open up the border with Mexico and allow a lot of people in. And I realize we need a lot of those people for the row crops and for the fruit industry. But I mean, is there a point where you have to really put controls on this?
When it comes to immigration, the Biden policy is almost identical in terms of function to the Trump administration policies. The only big change is that Biden has this perception, both here and in Central America, that he's going to be different. But he's actually made it more difficult to process asylum applications. And he's lobbying the Mexicans very, very strongly to maintain the Stay in Mexico program. I don't expect a lot of change because it looks like the Biden administration was trying to keep everything in place that Trump did and just kind of change the headlines. So it didn't look like we were being jerks about it. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be a change. It's just you have to understand where the change is coming from. Lopez Obrador, that's the Mexican president, got along fairly well with Donald Trump because Trump only cared about a couple of things. Get NAFTA 2 done, Mexico act as the wall to block the migrants from coming up. And as long as Trump got those two things, he turned a blind eye on absolutely everything else. The drug war, energy policy, privatization, investment, whatever it was, he didn't care. And AMLO loved that relationship. Biden is already pushing on the Mexicans harder on the issues that Trump dropped. And as a result, AMLO is saying that he's going to withdraw cooperation on things like migration. So the relationship is definitely becoming a lot more fractious, and that might change things. But finally, keep in mind, remember that we've got a demographic collapse going on around the world. It's happening in Mexico too. It just started in Mexico 30 years later. So Mexico's birth rate dropped off around the year 2000 and has never really recovered. What that means is that Mexico has run out of young people to send us. And so net migration from Mexico has now been negative 10 years in a row, and it'll probably never recover. The same transition has happened in Central America, just 5 years behind. So there's probably a few more years of being able to get labor from Central America, and then that's going to dry up too. So if your point of view is you don't like migrants crossing the border, it's not going to happen much longer. If your point of view is you really need those migrants to do work, that's not going to happen much longer either. And so one way or the other, we're going to have to adjust politically and economically to this new reality, which is going to mean different things for different people.
Did you have another one, Lori?
We have a comment regarding the labor issue in Washington, where there's an overturning of our overtime exemption for ag workers. So a comment from Ben, we're going to need a lot more migrant workers because we're only allowed to work 40 hours a week.
Yeah, and I'm warning you, there aren't very many more migrant workers to have. So if you haven't started exploring the possibilities for automation in your operation, you really need to get on it, because that's the way forward. The only other way that you can get labor is to lobby the State Department for an exemption so that you can import refugees from the Eastern Hemisphere. And I think you can imagine how politically complicated that might be.
Okay, from Lanny, what do you think is Bill Gates' agenda, buying farmland and pushing his plant-based meat? Is it all carbon play?
Bill Gates has so much money. I'd hesitate to suggest that there's a grand plan here. I think he's simply decided that he's had a few personal eureka moments, and he's throwing some money behind his own personal money behind a lot of things just to see what sticks. It's just what any of us would do with our investment portfolios, just on a much larger scale. He made it very clear when it comes to the big things, the things he really cares about, is that stomping out communicable diseases is his primary concern. That's the issue that gets him up out of bed and makes him face the day. Anything when it comes to green tech or farmland is a distant second for him. Now, I realize if you have as many billions as he does, that even his secondary issue can have a big splash in the markets. There's no denying that. And he is pushing for green agriculture. But look at the way that he has operated in all of his charities. He's big on developing the technologies and the methods that work and then distributing them. So honestly, I would say he's somebody you guys might want to consider partnering with, because if he pays for everything on the front end, you know, eureka.
That was all I had, Lori.
If anyone would like to unmute their lines and jump in, you're welcome to ask your questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, the trade deal with Trump on China sounded like he was going to require them to buy twice as much agricultural products, like from 30 billion to 60 billion, was it?
That sounds
What
about
do you
right.
think? What do you think happened to that? It sounds like what you're saying is that's out to sea on that deal.
Yeah, I would argue that the day that Trump got distracted by the next issue is the day that deal died, which honestly was the second day of the agreement. The Chinese will never give any concession. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. The Chinese will never abide by any concessions given in any trade deal if they feel they can get away with it. There's a reason why not very many countries have meaningful trade deals with the Chinese. Robert Lighthizer, who was the previous trade negotiator, discovered after the phase one deal was agreed that Trump had lost all interest in pushing it through. To Trump's credit, he put a lot of political capital behind forcing the Chinese to actually put things down in writing, and that had never been achieved before. But then he didn't put any political capital behind making sure that the Chinese feet were held to the fire and forced to actually enact the phase one, much less negotiate the phase two deal. I can't imagine that the Biden administration is going to have more political capital to address something like this. It is just easier to kind of follow what Trump did in his third year. And instead of trying to negotiate a new deal, just try to force the Chinese into concessions by punishing them wherever and whenever you find politically expedient. And I think that's the road we're on now.
That's okay. And I've got one more question. You mentioned the machinery might come hard to come by, the bigger stuff in the future here. I went to buy a 55 horsepower, which is just a little tractor. October 15th, I ordered it. It's now finally at the dealer, for me to pick up. But I noticed that on any of the smaller tractors, it was like 6 months out when I was looking for that. tractors. So is that what the question is what has happened? What happened? The COVID, what, and how did it do it?
Two things. Number one is absolutely COVID. We've had a lot of facilities in various parts of the world that have been shut down temporarily in order to be cleaned. You're seeing with everything from the cable that goes into telephone lines to Tesla batteries to farm equipment. There's definitely a COVID component to that. And then the second piece that is going to build as we move up is the relocation of the supply chain. Because if you have graduatingly higher tariffs from the United States going on China, you're going to have more and more of those facilities move back, and you're going to have disruptions in the supply chains to build the heavy equipment in the first place. So you're kind of in between two forces right now, neither of which are going to let up anytime soon.
All right, any other questions? Peter, do you have any closing comments, unless anyone wants to jump in with a question?
I would just want to underline that we all thought that 2020 was the strangest, most dangerous, craziest year in history. It has nothing on calendar year 2021. 2020 in many ways was just kind of the opening of the deglobalization trend. And we're really going to have a much better idea of what COVID can do this year compared to last year. It's not going to happen in the United States. It's going to happen everywhere else. And that gives the NAFTA countries the opportunity to retune their systems for what was going to be the new reality anyway. So 5 years from now, we might blame COVID for the end of the world that we knew, but honestly, all it did was speed it up and made the transition for us actually a little bit quicker and a little bit easier. But wow, it's going to be a wild ride.
All right, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Randy. We are going to send out Washington wheat beanies out to everyone who asked a question. So Joel, Curtis, Lanny, Ben, Larry, Peter, and Bob, we'll see those in the mail. We just want to invite you to take part in the rest of our webinar series, which continues this Thursday with Farm Service Agency and Natural Resource Conservation Services, providing important program information. You'll find information posted at wog.org. Thank you to our sponsors who made this educational series possible. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Everybody take care.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.